Imagine you're riding a horse in medieval England. You are a majestic knight, or shining armor, with a long sword at your side. On a dusty road, you see a suspicious person approaching you. Friend or foe? No idea. But if the worst comes to worst, you need to draw your sword quickly to defend yourself. And here's the thing, most people are right-handed. So, you'll probably want to keep your horse on the left side of the road, so that your right hand is always ready to draw your sword and attack your enemy if necessary. If you drive on the right side of the road, your sword will be on the opposite side, and when you draw it, you will most likely cut down your own horse before you can react to your enemy. So since ancient times, knights, soldiers, and merchants in England all drove on the left side of the road for convenience in fighting and protecting themselves. This was not just a personal habit, but gradually it became an unwritten rule that was later incorporated into official traffic laws. It could have ended there, but then came a man who broke all the European traffic rules. He was Napoleon Bonaparte. Unlike the British, Napoleon was not right-handed, he was left-handed. He felt more comfortable riding on the right, so his left hand was always ready to steer or hold a gun. Napoleon loved neatness, uniformity, and system. So when he became emperor, he forced all the countries he conquered to drive on the right. And so almost all of Europe switched to driving on the right, but there was a problem. England was never conquered by Napoleon. The United Kingdom, in the spirit of we follow no one, decided to continue driving on the left as is tradition. Not only that, they also applied this rule to all their colonies. As a result, places that were once British colonies, such as India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia, also keep the habit of driving on the left until now. In America, let's go back to the late 18th century, when America had just gained independence from the British Empire. At that time, Americans still drove on the left side of the road, just like the British, simply because they were a British colony. But in just a few decades, everything changed completely. It wasn't a general or a revolutionary decree, or Napoleon enacting new laws. Instead, it was the wagon that changed America's road habits. And in the late 18th century, as America's economy grew, farmers and merchants began using large wagons to transport their produce and goods from farm to town. These were not the compact, two-wheeled, horse-drawn vehicles of Europe. They were huge carts pulled by 4 to 6 oxen or horses. They were often called Conos Toga-style carts, named after the Conos Toga region of Pennsylvania where they were invented. The peculiarity of this vehicle is that there is no driver's seat on the vehicle, and the driver must of course sit on the horse or oxen on the left side to control the herd of cattle. If the driver sits on the left side, how can they easily observe the road and avoid collisions with other vehicles? Simply drive your vehicle on the right side of the road, so that the driver's left eye is directed toward the center of the road to help them see the opposite vehicle clearly and control it better. And so gradually, rural roads in America naturally formed the rule of pulling to the right. But the ox cart was not the only reason. There was also a political and cultural reason. The Americans did not like to follow the British way. After gaining independence in 1776, America wanted to assert its own identity. They did not want to be seen as a copy of Britain. The Americans changed many things to separate themselves from the influence of the British Kingdom. They changed the currency from British pounds to US dollars. The top leader was not called king, but president. And they also gradually abandoned British English pronunciation and created an American English. The way of the road must also be different. And in the early 19th century, some US states also officially set the rule that cars must drive on the right side of the road to be consistent with the way of transporting goods by tractor. But it was not until Pennsylvania, a fellow country state at that time, passed a right-hand drive law in 1972 that this rule began to spread and other states gradually followed. And by the mid-19th century, the whole of America had completely switched to driving on the right. This was completely opposite to England. And Americans liked it a lot. They didn't need anyone to force them, no Napoleon to order them. They decided to keep to the right on their own. If the cart laid the foundation, the car was what made the rule irreversible. When Henry Ford started mass-producing his car, the Model T, in 1908, he placed the steering wheel on the left side of the car. The reason being for the convenience of driving on the right. The Model T was the most popular car in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. And with the dominance of the American car industry, many countries began to switch from left to right to accommodate Ford's cars. Yet the British stuck to their old ways, with no Napoleon forcing them to, and no regard for what America or the rest of the world was doing. They kept to the left since the knights drew their swords on horseback, and they continued to do so no matter what the world did. Today, only about 35% of the world keeps to the left, while the remaining 65% keeps to the right. Over 165 countries drive on the right, and as such, there are just under 80 countries that still drive on the left. This creates a lot of funny situations. If you are a British tourist and you're driving into France, you will be horrified to find that you're driving on the wrong side of the road. When British colonies like Canada and South Africa became independent, they were torn about which side to follow. Canada decided to follow the US, but South Africa remained British. Many supercars like Ferraris and Lamborghinis were made in Italy where the steering wheel was on the right, but British customers demanded the steering wheel on the left. So the car company had to create a special version. And in Asia, among the countries that drive on the left, there's one country that has nothing to do with being a British colony, but still does it: Japan. Now, imagine you're walking down a busy street in Tokyo during the Edo period. When Japan was still a feudal country, it was full of majestic samurai. On their shoulders were sharp takana swords, ready to be drawn at any time if danger arose. But there was one problem: most samurai were right-handed. If they walked on the right side of the road, their swords would clash with those coming from the opposite direction, causing a lot of trouble. If they wanted to help the quick sword defend themselves, they needed a more advantageous position. And so the samurai chose to walk on the left side, keeping their right hand ready to fight. From then on, the personal habits of the warrior class gradually spread to the Japanese society. No one gave orders, no royal decree, but an unwritten rule was born that driving on the left was safer and more reasonable. Things may have changed when Japan entered the modern era, but fate made them stick to this rule. When Japan opened up and industrialized in the late 19th century, it had to learn from the West. One of the most important things was its railway system. It did not learn from America or Germany, but from Britain, which drove on the left. In 1872, Japan's first railway line was built between Tokyo and Yokohama, designed by British engineers. And since trains in Britain ran on the left, the Japanese followed suit. This created a massive transport system that relied entirely on left-hand driving, making any subsequent change extremely difficult. Japan was in a state of flux when cars were introduced in the early 20th century, and there were no official traffic laws. Some areas of Japan drove on the right, especially Hokkaido, which had American influence. But eventually, the Japanese government decided to make the train system a permanent left-hand drive, and in 1924, the Japanese government decided to make it an official law requiring all vehicles to drive on the left to keep in line with the railways. The closest Japan came to changing to driving on the right was in 1945, after the country had lost World War II and was occupied by the United States. When the Americans took over Okinawa, they implemented the right-hand rule, making the island the only part of Japan where traffic was on the opposite side of the country. For 27 years, Okinawans drove on the right like the Americans, but in 1972, when the United States returned Okinawa to Japan, the government immediately ordered traffic to change to the left. The Japanese saw it as a symbol of their restored sovereignty, and they have never looked back. Today, while much of the world drives on the right, Japan sticks to its left-hand rule, partly because of its samurai history, partly because of British railways, partly because of its steadfast spirit. As for Britain Day, they like to keep it traditional. They still drink tea in the afternoon, still use the inch system, still drive on the left, and still don't care what the world thinks. The British left-hand drive is one of those interesting relics of history. It started with the horse-riding swordsman and was reinforced by the spirit, like no other, of the British. And to this day, even though the rest of the world drives on the right, the British still stubbornly keep to their side of the road, literally.